A mirror's surface reflects more than flesh, it reflects centuries of decay. You see the jutting jaw, the crooked spine, the pale waxen skin of Charles II of Spain. It is 1700, and though you are but 38, your body has aged with the weight of generations. You cannot eat, you cannot rule, you cannot father heirs. The end of a dynasty stares back at you through hollow eyes. Welcome to Timeless Witnesses, where history's truths cannot be hidden. You can barely eat solid food, and you know, with the terrible clarity that sometimes comes to the dying, that this is not your fault. Your suffering stems from a single horrifying truth. Every drop of blood in your veins has been poisoned by the choices of your ancestors. For 16 generations, your family has married cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, brother to sister, in their obsession with keeping their bloodline pure. They called it maintaining divine right. They called it preserving their sacred Habsburg heritage. What they created was you, the final broken endpoint of the most extreme genetic experiment in human history. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please, comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The Spanish Habsburg dynasty, a study in genetic catastrophe. Our story begins in 1516 when the House of Habsburg first took control of Spain. What followed was nearly 2 centuries of the most systematic inbreeding program ever attempted by a royal family. The Spanish Habsburgs didn't just occasionally marry cousins. They made it their defining characteristic. Of the 11 marriages contracted by Spanish Habsburg monarchs, between 1450 and 1661, 9 were between blood relatives. Uncle married niece. First cousins wed first cousins. In some cases, the genetic overlap was so extreme that children were born with inbreeding coefficients approaching those of siblings. The men who ruled during this period weren't the strong, decisive monarchs that royal propaganda portrayed. They were the victims of their own family's genetic obsessions, each generation more damaged than the last. Charles I, the foundation of disaster. Charles V Spain, also known as Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, seemed like an unlikely candidate for our story. Born in 1500, he inherited the largest empire in European history, stretching from Spain to Austria, from the Netherlands to southern Italy. He was intelligent, politically astute, and initially healthy. But look closely at his portraits and you begin to see the warning signs. Antonio de Beatis, an Italian diplomat who met Charles in 1517, described him as having a long, cadaverous face and a lopsided mouth which drops open when he is not on his guard. Charles had inherited the beginning of what would become known as the Habsburg jaw, a protruding lower mandible that made his mouth hang open when he wasn't consciously controlling it. Charles had an inbreeding coefficient of 0.038, relatively low for his family, but already higher than what would be considered safe in any normal bloodline. His parents were cousins but distantly related compared to the unions that would follow. The real tragedy of Charles I wasn't his own suffering, but his decisions about marriage. Despite ruling an empire that spanned continents, despite having access to potential brides from across Europe, Charles chose to marry his cousin Isabel of Portugal. Isabel's mother was Charles's aunt, his father's sister. The couple was so closely related that they needed special papal dispensation to wed. Their son, the future Philip II, would inherit not just the Spanish Empire, but an even more concentrated dose of Habsburg genetic damage. Charles abdicated in 56, worn down by the burden of ruling his vast territories, and by the growing awareness that something was fundamentally wrong with his bloodline. He retired to a monastery where he spent his final years in prayer and contemplation, perhaps seeking divine forgiveness for the genetic catastrophe he had helped perpetuate. Philip II, the Zealot's burden. Philip II inherited the Spanish throne at its zenith of power, but he also inherited a genetic legacy that would define his entire reign. Born in 1527, Philip exhibited the classic Habsburg features from an early age: the elongated face, the hooded eyes, and the increasingly prominent jaw that made eating and speaking difficult. But Philip's genetic inheritance went beyond physical deformity. Modern historians believe he suffered from severe depression and possibly autism spectrum disorders, conditions that made him obsessively focused on detail but incapable of the broad strategic thinking his empire required. Philip's approach to governance reflected the mental rigidity that often accompanies inbreeding depression. He became fixated on religious orthodoxy, launching the Inquisition with unprecedented brutality. He spent hours each day reading and responding to administrative minutiae while neglecting crucial strategic decisions. His advisors reported that he would sometimes spend an entire day crafting a single letter, rewriting it multiple times to achieve what he considered perfect wording. The tragedy of Philip II wasn't just personal, it was imperial. His genetic limitations contributed to Spain's decline as a global power, while more flexible rulers might have adapted to changing circumstances. Philip's rigid thinking led to disastrous wars in the Netherlands, the failed invasion of England, and economic policies that bankrupted the Spanish treasury. Philip married 4 times, desperately seeking male heirs to secure the succession. His first wife, Maria of Portugal, was his cousin. Their mothers were sisters. When Maria died young, Philip married Mary d'Este of England in a political alliance. That marriage produced no children. His third wife, Elizabeth of Valois, was unrelated to the Habsburg line, and their children were healthier than average for the dynasty. But for his fourth and final marriage, Philip returned to the family tradition. He married his niece, Anna of Austria, daughter of his brother Maximilian II. Anna was 22 years younger than Philip and was literally his brother's daughter. Their union produced Philip III, who would carry even more concentrated Habsburg genes into the next generation. Philip III, the pious fool. Philip III, born in 1578, represented everything wrong with the Habsburg approach to monarchy. Contemporary accounts describe him as mentally slow, physically weak, and utterly dependent on advisors to make even basic decisions. His inbreeding coefficient was so high that modern geneticists consider it remarkable that he survived to adulthood. Philip III's physical appearance shocked even courtiers accustomed to Habsburg peculiarities. His jaw protruded so severely that he couldn't properly close his mouth. He drooled constantly and had such difficulty chewing that his food had to be pre-cut into tiny pieces. His speech was nearly incomprehensible, slurred by his malformed mouth and enlarged tongue. But perhaps more tragic than his physical deformities were his mental limitations. Philip III was described by contemporaries as having the mental capacity of a child. He was deeply religious, but in a superstitious way that suggested cognitive impairment rather than genuine spirituality. He believed in omens, spent hours each day in prayer, and left the actual governing of Spain to a series of favorites who exploited his weakness for their own benefit. The economic and political decline of Spain accelerated under Philip III's reign. While he focused on religious ceremonies and court etiquette, Spain lost control of the Netherlands, saw its American colonies become increasingly independent, and faced multiple bankruptcies. The empire that had dominated Europe for a century began its irreversible decline under a king who couldn't understand the complexities of governing. Philip III married Margaret of Austria. Yes, another cousin. And their children represented the next stage in the Habsburg genetic experiment. Their son, the future Philip I, would inherit an even more concentrated dose of the family's genetic defects. Philip IV, the melancholy king. Philip IV, born in 1605, ruled Spain for 44 years, one of the longest reigns in Spanish history, but length didn't equal quality. Philip IV presided over the continued decline of Spanish power while struggling with his own genetic inheritance. Diego Velázquez's portraits of Philip IV show us exactly what centuries of inbreeding had produced. The king had the classic Habsburg features taken to an extreme: the protruding jaw, the elongated skull, the hooded eyes that seemed to stare with vacant incomprehension. His auburn hair framed a face that contemporary observers described as melancholy and distant. Philip IV suffered from severe depression, what modern psychiatrists would recognize as major depressive disorder with possible psychotic features. Court records describe periods when the king would remain in his chambers for weeks at a time, refusing to see visitors or attend to state business. During these episodes, he would sometimes talk to paintings as if they were real people, or become convinced that courtiers were plotting against him. The king's mental state wasn't helped by the constant pressure to produce a male heir. His first wife, Isabella of Bourbon, was a cousin, and their marriage produced several children who died in infancy or childhood. Only one daughter, Maria Teresa, survived to adulthood, but as a female she couldn't inherit the Spanish throne. When Isabella died in 1644, Philip I faced a crisis. He needed a male heir, but his genetic inheritance made healthy childbearing increasingly unlikely. Following family tradition, he married his niece Mariana of Austria. Mariana was his brother's daughter, making their union one of the closest blood relationships in Habsburg history. The marriage between Philip IV and his niece Mariana produced several children, most of whom died young. The survivors included Margaret Teresa, who would be married off to her uncle Leopoldi. Yes, another uncle-niece pairing. And finally, in 1661, a son who would become Charles II. Philip IV died in 1665, leaving behind an empire in decline and a 4-year-old heir whose genetic inheritance would prove to be the most extreme in European royal history. Charles II, the bewitched king. Charles II represents the absolute nadir of royal inbreeding. Born on November 6, 1661, he entered the world already bearing the accumulated genetic damage of 16 generations of cousin marriage. His inbreeding coefficient was 0.254, higher than that typically seen in the children of siblings. From birth, Charles II was obviously different. French court records describe him as a child with herpes-type rashes, a head covered in scabs, and a kind of drainage that oozes from the right ear. There were even rumors that his sexual organs were so malformed that courtiers couldn't initially determine his gender. Charles never learned to walk properly. His legs were weak and malformed. His spine curved unnaturally, and his balance was so poor that he needed constant support. He didn't speak his first words until age 4. And even then, his speech was so slurred by his enlarged tongue and malformed jaw that only his closest attendants could understand him. The famous Habsburg jaw reached its grotesque peak in Charles II. His lower jaw protruded so far that he couldn't close his mouth or chew solid food. Meals became ordeals of careful positioning and slow, painful swallowing. Court physicians described watching him eat as distressing to witness. Food would fall from his mouth, and he would struggle for minutes to swallow what others consumed in seconds. Charles's mental capacity was severely limited. He couldn't read or write beyond a basic level, struggled to understand simple concepts, and often seemed confused about where he was or what was happening around him. Contemporary accounts describe him as having the mental development of a young child, even as an adult. The Spanish court gave Charles II the nickname El Hechizado, the bewitched, because they couldn't understand how someone could be so physically and mentally impaired without supernatural intervention. They subjected him to constant exorcisms and religious ceremonies, believing that evil spirits had possessed him. Charles II married twice. both times to foreign princesses who were horrified by his condition. His first wife, Marie-Louise of Orleans, was reportedly so repulsed by his appearance and behavior that she avoided being alone with him. Court observers noted that she would visibly flinch when he tried to speak to her. The marriage produced no children. After Marie-Louise died in 1689, Charles married Maria Anna of Nauburg. This second marriage was equally childless. Charles II's impotence wasn't just psychological. His genetic damage had made him physically incapable of reproduction. Charles II died on November 1st, 1700, just days before his 39th birthday. His death certificate listed various immediate causes, but the real cause was obvious to anyone willing to see it. He died because 16 generations of his ancestors had chosen genetic purity over human welfare. With Charles II's death, the Spanish Habsburg line came to an end. His will named Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV of France, as his heir, sparking the War of Spanish Succession. But perhaps more importantly, his death ended the most extreme experiment in royal inbreeding that Europe had ever seen. The Egyptian pharaohs, where it all began. Long before the Habsburgs made inbreeding infamous, the pharaohs of ancient Egypt had perfected the practice. For over 3 millennia, Egyptian royal families practiced sibling marriage as a religious duty, believing that their divine blood must not be diluted with that of mere mortals. Akhenaten, the heretic king's hidden suffering. Akhenaten ruled Egypt during the 18th dynasty, around 1353 to 1336 BCE. He's famous for revolutionizing Egyptian religion, abandoning the traditional pantheon of gods in favor of worshipping only Aten, the sun disk. But Akhenaten's radical religious reforms may have been influenced by the genetic damage that plagued his family. Surviving statues and relief carvings of Akhenaten show a man with distinctly abnormal features. His face was extremely elongated, with a pointed chin and sunken cheeks. His neck was unnaturally long and thin, supporting a skull that appeared almost alien in its proportions. His body was equally strange, thin arms and legs, supporting a torso with pronounced breasts and a distended belly that made him appear pregnant. Modern medical experts have proposed several diagnoses for Akhenaten's condition. Erwin Braverman of Yale University suggests that the pharaoh suffered from 2 genetic disorders: aromatase et Kes syndrome, which would cause his body to convert male hormones to female hormones, and craniosynostosis, which would explain his elongated skull. These conditions would be consistent with the effects of inbreeding. Akhenaten's parents, Amenhotep III and Queen Tai, were likely related, continuing a family tradition that stretched back generations. The genetic damage accumulated in their son manifested not just in physical deformities, but possibly in the religious mania that drove him to completely restructure Egyptian society. Akhenaten married his own sister Nefertiti in keeping with royal tradition. But he also married his daughters, Meritaten and Ankhesenamun, in unions that produced children so genetically damaged that none survived to adulthood. The royal family's genetic isolation had become so extreme that it could no longer produce viable heirs. Tutankhamun, the boy king's tragic legacy. Tutankhamun, who ruled Egypt from approximately 1332 to 1323 BCE, is one of history's most famous pharaohs, but not for reasons he would have wanted. The discovery of his intact tomb in 1922 revealed not just incredible treasures, but evidence of a young man whose life was defined by genetic suffering. Modern DNA analysis has revealed the truth about Tutankhamun's parentage. His father was Akhenaten, and his mother was one of Akhenaten's sisters. This brother-sister union produced a child so genetically damaged that he could barely function as a king. Tutankhamun suffered from a severe club foot that made walking extremely difficult. His tomb contained 130 walking sticks, not ceremonial objects but practical aids that he needed to move around. CT scans of his mummy reveal a cleft palate that would have affected his speech, a curved spine that forced him into a hunched posture, and an elongated skull similar to his father's. The boy king also suffered from multiple genetic disorders that weakened his immune system. DNA analysis found evidence of malaria parasites in his bones, the earliest confirmed case of the disease in human history. But Tutankhamun's genetic damage made him particularly vulnerable to infections that a healthy person might have survived. Modern medical analysis suggests that Tutankhamun suffered from Keuler disease, a rare condition that causes bone tissue in the foot to die. This would have been incredibly painful and would explain the many walking aids found in his tomb, combined with his other genetic disorders. It's remarkable that he survived to age 19. Tutankhamun married his half-sister Ankhesenamun, continuing the family tradition of incest. Their 2 children were stillborn, their tiny mummified bodies buried with their father. Genetic analysis suggests these infants suffered from such severe birth defects that they couldn't survive outside the womb. The young pharaoh died around 1323 BCE, possibly from a combination of malaria, his genetic disorders, and complications from a broken leg. His death marked the end of the direct line of the 18th dynasty, as he left no surviving heirs, the Ptolemaic dynasty. Greek pharaohs and systematic incest. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BCE, he established the Ptolemaic dynasty that would rule for nearly 300 years. But the Ptolemies took Egyptian traditions of royal incest to extremes that shocked even their contemporaries. The Ptolemaic marriage system. The Ptolemies weren't just occasional practitioners of incest. They made it their defining characteristic. Starting with Ptolemy II and his sister wife Arsinoe II, the dynasty practiced systematic sibling marriage for generation after generation. Brothers married sisters as a matter of course, and the resulting children married their own siblings in turn. This wasn't done out of passion or even political necessity. It was a calculated attempt to keep power concentrated within the royal family. By marrying only each other, the Ptolemies ensured that no outsider could claim a share of Egyptian wealth or influence, but the genetic consequences were devastating. Modern analysis of Ptolemaic mummies and coins reveals a family increasingly marked by obesity, swollen necks, and prominent eyes, all signs of genetic disorders caused by extreme inbreeding. Ptolemy VIII, the bloated king, Ptolemy VIII, who ruled from 170, 163 BCE, and again from 145, 116 BCE, exemplified the physical deterioration that marked the later Ptolemaic dynasty. Contemporary accounts describe him as grotesquely obese, with a belly so large that he could barely walk. His nickname, Fiskin, meaning fatty, reflected his most obvious characteristic. But Ptolemy VIII's problems went beyond mere obesity. He suffered from what modern doctors would recognize as multiple endocrine disorders, probably caused by his inbred heritage. His neck was swollen with what appears to have been a goiter, and his eyes bulged from their sockets, classic signs of thyroid disease. The king's mental state was equally problematic. He was paranoid, violent, and prone to sudden rages that terrified his courtiers. Historical accounts describe him ordering mass executions of Alexandrian intellectuals and engaging in feuds with family members that devastated the royal line. Ptolemy VIII married his sister Cleopatra II, but also took his niece Cleopatra III as a second wife. These overlapping relationships produced children whose genetic inheritance was so concentrated that many died young or suffered from obvious developmental problems. By the time of the last Ptolemies, the dynasty's genetic isolation had reached catastrophic levels. Cleopatra VII, the famous Cleopatra of history, was the product of at least 8 generations of sibling marriage. Her parents were siblings. Her grandparents were siblings. And so on back through the family tree. Despite Hollywood portrayals, the real Cleopatra bore little resemblance to Elizabeth Taylor. Coins and sculptures show a woman with the typical Ptolemaic features: a hooked nose, a round face, and a heavy build that suggested the metabolic disorders common in her family. Cleopatra VII was forced to marry her younger brothers Ptolemy XIII and later Ptolemy XIII, continuing the family tradition even as it became clear that the dynasty was genetically exhausted. Her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony weren't just political alliances. They represented desperate attempts to introduce new genetic material into a bloodline that could no longer sustain itself. When Cleopatra died in 30 BCE, she ended not just the Ptolemaic dynasty, but 3 centuries of the most systematic royal inbreeding ever practiced. Her children by Roman fathers would continue various royal lines, but the pure Ptolemaic bloodline died with her. To understand these tragic stories, we need to examine the genetic science that explains why inbreeding causes such devastating effects. When closely related individuals reproduce, their children have a much higher chance of inheriting 2 copies of harmful recessive genes. In a healthy, genetically diverse population, harmful recessive genes are usually masked by normal copies inherited from unrelated parents. But when cousins marry cousins for generation after generation, these harmful genes accumulate and compound, creating the devastating effects we've seen in our historical examples. The Habsburg jaw, for instance, is a classic example of how inbreeding can concentrate harmful traits. This mandibular prognathism became more pronounced with each generation of cousin marriage, eventually becoming so severe that Charles II couldn't properly close his mouth or chew solid food. Modern genetic analysis of the Habsburg family tree shows that Charles II had an inbreeding coefficient of 0.254, meaning that 25.4% of his genes were identical because they came from the same ancestors. For comparison, the child of 2 first cousins would have an inbreeding coefficient of 0.0625, and the child of siblings would have 0.25. Charles II was essentially the genetic equivalent of a child born to siblings, but with additional damage accumulated over 16 generations. The effects of this extreme inbreeding weren't limited to physical deformities. Inbreeding depression affects not just appearance, but also immune function, mental capacity, and fertility. Many of the Habsburg descendants suffered from increased rates of epilepsy, intellectual disabilities, anxiety disorders, depression, and immune system deficiencies. What makes these stories particularly tragic is how preventable they were. The genetic science that explains inbreeding depression wasn't available to medieval and early modern rulers, but the effects were obvious to anyone willing to see them. Royal courts had extensive records documenting the health problems that plagued inbred bloodlines. Court physicians wrote detailed reports on the physical and mental health problems affecting royal children. The connection between cousin marriage and genetic damage was clear to contemporaries. But political and economic considerations always took precedence over human welfare. The men whose stories we've explored, Charles II, Philip IV, Tutankhamun, Akhenaten, and the Ptolemaic kings, were victims of a system that treated them as means to an end rather than as individuals deserving of dignity and health. They were reduced to their reproductive function, valued only for their ability to continue bloodlines that had become genetically poisoned. These rulers lived with constant physical pain, mental confusion, and the knowledge that their suffering stemmed from decisions made by ancestors who should have known better. They endured mocking nicknames like El Hechizado and Fiscon, became the subjects of court gossip about their mental and physical limitations, and faced the daily humiliation of being unable to perform the basic functions expected of kings. Perhaps most tragically, many of these men perpetuated the system that had destroyed them. Charles II married twice, despite his obvious unfitness for reproduction. Tutankhamun married his half-sister and produced stillborn children. The Ptolemaic kings continued sibling marriage even as their dynasty crumbled around them. The extreme inbreeding that characterized these royal dynasties finally came to an end in the early modern period. As courts began to understand the genetic risks involved, and as political circumstances changed to favor broader international alliances, the death of Charles II in 1700 marked not just the end of the Spanish Habsburg line, but the beginning of a new understanding of royal marriage. The War of Spanish Succession that followed his death established new patterns of European diplomacy that prioritized strategic alliances over genetic purity. Similarly, the conquest of Egypt by Rome ended the Ptolemaic dynasty's practice of systematic sibling marriage. While cousin marriages continued among European royalty, they became less common and less closely related as courts began to recognize the dangers of extreme inbreeding. The scientific revolution of the 17th and 18th centuries gradually provided explanations for the genetic disasters that had plagued royal families. While the mechanisms of inheritance wouldn't be fully understood until the 20th century, observant physicians and natural philosophers began to document the connection between cousin marriage and genetic disorders. Today, these tragic stories serve as reminders of the importance of putting human welfare above political expediency, of recognizing the individual dignity of every person regardless of their social status, and of understanding that even the most powerful institutions can perpetuate tremendous suffering when they lose sight of basic human values. We return now to that cold mirror, that moment of terrible recognition. But this time we see not just Charles II's reflection, but the faces of all the men whose stories we've explored. Akhenaten's elongated features, Tutankhamun's clubfoot, Philip IV's melancholy stare, the bloated visage of Ptolemy VIII. These weren't monsters or curiosities. They were human beings who deserved better than the genetic lottery forced upon them by birth. Their suffering wasn't divine punishment or supernatural curse. It was the predictable result of human choices made by people who valued bloodline purity over human welfare. In their pain, we find profound lessons about the dangers of treating people as means to an end, about the importance of genetic diversity, and about the responsibility we all bear to learn from the mistakes of the past. Their stories remind us that true nobility lies not in the purity of one's bloodline, but in the courage to acknowledge our common humanity and to ensure that such systematic genetic destruction is never again pursued in the name of royal tradition. The mirror doesn't lie, even when we wish it would. But in the reflection of these tragic kings, we see not just the consequences of inbreeding, but the enduring human spirit that persisted despite impossible circumstances. Their legacy is both a warning and a testament, a reminder that even in the darkest moments of human history, we can find the strength to choose compassion over tradition, diversity over purity, and human dignity over political expedience. In the end, the curse of keeping bloodlines pure has finally been broken. But the memory of these men lives on, not as examples of royal power or genetic superiority, but as reminders of the price paid when humanity is sacrificed on the altar of political ambition.